continue your dinner, we will start tonight's program. I'm delighted to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Mireya Solis. Dr. Solis, I have met her for the first time several years ago in the event of the Mansfield Foundation. For a long time, it was my dream to invite her to Dallas and ask her to talk about U.S.-Japan relations. I have known of her work for a long time. So she, especially two most recent books, I read very carefully because they talk about Japanese trade policy. So several years ago, a few years ago, she published a book titled Dilemmas of a Trading Nation. This becomes a textbook for me to study trade politics, both Japan and the United States. And then today's topic of today's talk, Japan's quiet leadership, just published. Overall, Dr. Solis' approach is two characteristics. One is what I would call inside out. So she looks at international relations from domestic politics perspective. The other is her argument has a tone of Japan is underrated, and that is certainly true. And then the last year when I went to Japan for the first time since pandemic, I also realized that Japan is not a country that you can understand through numbers. If you look at numbers, it makes sense to underrate Japan. Japan's GDP growth rate is about 0% for last 3 decades. Japan's productivity is very low, and Japan has a problem of aging society. So it makes sense to underrate Japan, but at the same time, if you go to Japan, you will find a lot of interesting things that cannot be counted for the number like a GDP or productivity. So Dr. Solis has been watching Japan for, I think now decades, and always her work, she is my teacher at the same time, and she is my senpai. And most importantly for me, she is a very good friend of mine. Please join me for welcoming Dr. Mireya Solis.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with all of you. I have to say it's my first time in Dallas, and I'm enjoying it tremendously. I want to thank the Tower Center, the organizers, in particular Professor Hiroki Takeuchi, for this kind invitation, that very generous introduction. It is my great pleasure to speak at the Sun and Star Symposium on Japan and East Asia, and to be able to talk about my most recent book. That's every author's dream, right? To talk about the book, Japan's Quiet Leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific. The theme of the symposium, the rise of authoritarianism and U.S.-Japan relations, captures well the main questions that I would like to explore with all of you today. In this very turbulent world, what kind of international role will Japan play? Why should we have greater expectations of the contributions that Japan can make in this time of disarray? The question, I would say, is how can we explain Japan's re-emergence from the so-called lost decades to become an indispensable ally of the United States and a consequential actor shaping the Indo-Pacific? So, clearly we're living in difficult times. So I will start with a very sobering picture, just a few minutes, to give you a sense of what the source of stress in international system are, so we can understand what role Japan can play going forward. So many headwinds. First of all, domestic politics. The domestic malaise in many liberal democracies is evident, as social inequality, political polarization, and populist upheaval undermine the institutions of representative democracy. In a broad expanse of the world, democratic decline is evident. It's taken hold as authoritarianism is on the rise. A large portion of the developing world is reeling from unequal recovery from the pandemic, food and commodity price hikes, protectionism in advanced countries, and of course, debt insolvency. A technology revolution is transforming how societies, economies, political systems operate. These emerging technologies hold great promise. They can deliver wonderful opportunities, but they come also with great responsibilities as we're just beginning to reckon with artificial intelligence. And while globalization has lifted millions out of poverty, the weaponization of economic interdependence has grown the appeal of defensive economic measures and provided impetus to try to restructure far-flung supply chains. China and the United States increasingly define their relationship in terms of competition and rivalry. China's non-transparent military buildup and its expansive territorial claims in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, with disregard for international law, have increased tensions in the region. The United States, quite frankly, is consumed by domestic divisions, which has led to major foreign policy fluctuations when it comes to embracing or not the value of alliances. And the one area where there is consistency is where the United States has given its back to continue to champion free trade. Tensions in the Taiwan Strait, in the Korea Peninsula, in Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now the Middle East, underscore the fraught moment in history that we're living. So probably it's not a good thing to start a keynote on such a sober note, but I'm not delivering news to you. I think we're all living it today. So then let me turn to Japan's own transformation and what Japan has been doing in the region and beyond. I would say that in this turbulent new world, Japan has emerged as an increasingly important ally for the United States in areas that Washington has identified as top priorities, consolidating its role as an Indo-Pacific power and addressing the complex, multifaceted China challenge. The U.S.-Japan alliance has deepened, particularly in the wake of Japan's 2015 national security reforms, whereby the Japanese government recognized the right of collective self-defense under certain conditions. But beyond the bilateral deepening of the security bond, as important as it is, it's important also to note a new phenomenon, and that is unilateral security cooperation. And that is the United States and Japan are doing more with others. And you see it, for example, in the Quad, or you see it more recently in this important trilateral initiative, the Camp David Summit of last summer between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So the Biden administration today is trying to cultivate these like-minded partnerships. And in most of these initiatives, Japan is front and center. The alliance has become more multidimensional with a new economic security track and initiatives on supply chain resilience, the protection of sensitive technologies, efforts to curb economic coercion. In fact, think about how striking this is. In some areas, there actually has been a reversal of roles. It is Japan, not the United States, which has brokered mega trade agreements, which has provided robust infrastructure finance that can compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, that is pushing for the codification of rules for the digital economy. And as more and more economies turn digital, this is going to become incredibly important. And because of Tokyo's more proactive foreign policy, the old frames that we used in the past to talk about Japan no longer apply. They're no longer accurate. Japan is much more today than the junior partner hosting U.S. military bases in exchange for shelter under the nuclear umbrella, or the passive actor that then played a regional political role, or that played defensive in international trade following the rules drafted by others. That is no longer the Japan that we see today. So to me, this really gets to the heart of the matter. How did we get here? What happened in those 30 years that we were frequently told are just gloom and doom, and that Japan could not get the right choices in place? How can a country experiencing a loss of relative capabilities, which is very true, because of adverse demographic trends, a long deflationary era, and the robust military buildup around it, how can it nevertheless navigate around these constraints and manage to articulate a far more ambitious and effective foreign policy, so much so that Japan is now at the center of the new economic and political architecture that is being built in the Indo-Pacific? To explain this puzzle of how can Japan do more with less, if you will, or how can Japan navigate this very turbulent world and become a key partner of the United States, the book focused on three broad arguments, three broad factors. And I know I'm covering a lot of territory, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of how significant is this process of evolution in Japan and how we see it manifested in its alliance with the United States and the Indo-Pacific dynamics. So what are these three broad factors that the book highlights as explaining Japan's more proactive foreign policy? One, which I think is really interesting point of conversation, of analysis, is that the populist wave that has created so much turmoil in so many industrialized countries missed Japan. Japan has not had the populist backlash, the turn towards economic nationalism, the rejection of globalization that we see in many other places. We do not find steep social and political polarization that has in many other places led to turmoil and the erosion of the institutions of representative democracy. And one of the unsung glories of Japan, I would say, that is part of the piece of the puzzle that explains why Japan has not suffered this globalization backlash, has to do with the adjustment mechanisms to deal with economic change. The fact that Japan built its economic relation with China mostly by relying heavily on supply chain trade. The fact that Japan has provided a more robust safety net and greater employment security has also softened some of these economic adjustments. So that's one important factor, I think, that we need to take into account. The other one is, and this used to be a word, a lexicon that I don't think we used frequently when I was a grad student looking at Japan, and that is prime ministerial leadership. Japan was not a country where the prime minister took the lead in coming with very important foreign economic or foreign policy initiatives. And what happened during this period is that through institutional and administrative reforms that enhanced the powers of the prime minister office, it was now possible for the prime minister to launch new initiatives, to overcome the reluctance of warring bureaucracies, and Japan suffered tremendously from bureaucratic sectionalism, and to not be the captive of the iron triangles. Many people used to feel that Japan was the paradise of vested interest, iron triangles, and therefore it was very difficult to come up with broad strategic initiatives and see them through. That has changed. And now we see Japan having whole of government decision-making, and in some cases has served the country well. For example, as I mentioned before, Japan used to be consumed by its own domestic political constraints and play a very offensive role in international trade. That was not the Japan that participated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Initiative and rescued it after the United States left abruptly. And it was possible because Japan created a national headquarters where you had the elite bureaucrats come and represent and negotiate on behalf of the national interest and not their own specific ministry. Or you have the creation of a National Security Council and the adoption for the first time of a national security strategy in 2013 and more recently in December 2022, where you actually see the articulation of this more strategic vision. And the third broad factor, and this is really what the book is about, is what I call Japan's grand strategy. One that I would describe as connectivity, one that I would describe as becoming a network power. So what you have is that clearly Tokyo is aware of the resource constraints it faces because it's not growing fast, as Hiroki told us, because demographic decline is a big concern. And when you have limited resources, I think that the best way to take advantage of that is by creating networks and partnerships. And I would say that this amounts to an all-out diplomatic effort on both the economic and security domains. So again, you have Japan coming out and brokering mega trade agreements. And you have Japan becoming deeply embedded in the fabric of the Indo-Pacific. And I would say that for the first time, we see Tokyo articulating, putting forward a vision for the regional order in the free and open Indo-Pacific. And I believe that the free and open Indo-Pacific frame has become very relevant. And now you see many other countries coming with their own articulation of this strategy, the United States and many others. And they differ in the details, they differ in the overall goals, but nevertheless, Japan has provided us with that frame. And that is, I think, an important contribution. I think that it has gained traction in the case of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy because it provides principles that aim to shore regional stability, about freedom of navigation, respect for the rule of law, freedom from coercion, but it's also backed by tangible economic benefits. I already described some of the economic benefits in terms of development assistance, infrastructure, finance, but also in terms of Japan providing capacity building to many developing countries in Southeast Asia to enhance their maritime safety. Now, of course, Japan is more capable today, and I hope I have hinted that now Japan has a strong track record. But I would say that it still faces many, many different challenges ahead. Adjusting to a fractured world is not easy. So in my remaining time, and I have no idea how I'm doing on time, I think I have like 5 minutes. Let me just walk you through some of the most important challenges that I see Japan facing today. And these challenges are obviously interconnected, and they affect the United States because, as I've been referring constantly, Japan is an essential ally of the United States in the region. Let me start on the domestic front, some of the good news and also some of the challenges. On the economy, I would say we don't always give this kind of positive news talking about the Japanese economy, but this is actually a very exciting time in the sense that Japan is officially exiting the deflation chapter. Just a few days ago, the Bank of Japan terminated the policy of negative interest rates, its policy of yield curve control to keep the interest rate on government bonds low. And this was the governor of the Bank of Japan, Mr. Ueda, decided to do this. He was persuaded by the fact that Japan experienced the largest average wage increase in 33 years, and that inflation has now for the past 23 months been at or above the target rate of 2%. So when you have a generation of Japanese going through deflation, coming out of it is certainly a very, very positive set of news. Does this mean that we are on the other side? Certainly not. There are many challenges for the Japanese economy. There are many challenges for normalizing monetary policy. We don't know yet if these wage increases will really lead to that robust increase in domestic consumption, that virtuous circle that the government of Japan would like to see in place. But these are good news. Now, if I talk about Japanese politics, I cannot be as optimistic. I'll be very candid and frank with you. Japanese politics are messy and in flux. And, there's a huge political scandal in Japan because of the failure of several factions, groupings inside the Liberal Democratic Party, who did not report kickbacks to politicians from fundraising parties. And this has diminished the confidence of the public in the Kishida administration, in the LDP. And I said in flux because in the past few weeks, we've seen some of the factions being dissolved. We've seen attempts by Prime Minister Kishida to push forward a political reform agenda, and he faces many, many different challenges on this front. One immediate task is to decide how to punish senior LDP politicians who have been found involved in this kind of practice. And Prime Minister Kishida has struggled with his public approval rates for several months now, and it's not clear whether when the next LDP party election takes place in September, whether he will manage to be re-elected or not. And the fact that I cannot answer to you the question, if not Kishida, who then, I think is also indicative of some of the challenges in political leadership that Japan faces. Now, that was just bucket one. Let me just very quickly finish with the two other buckets of challenges, because they're going to weigh heavily on Japan and many other countries. One is, of course, that Japan lives in an incredibly dangerous neighborhood. Compounding geopolitical risks cannot be denied. With the situation in the Taiwan Strait, with the more reckless policies and actions from North Korea, it's certain that the U.S.-Japan alliance will remain the bedrock of Japan's security. But the allies have a lot of work to do in deepening that security bond and increasing deterrence against Chinese coercion or North Korea's provocations. And again, I promised to you I would be very candid tonight, and I would continue to be so. In Japan, there's a lot of concern about the zigzag of US politics, as I mentioned before, because we don't know what will happen in November, and it could be that we have a president that, the comeback of a president who has invested in renewing alliances, or the comeback of a president who is very skeptical of alliances. And there is, for the people coming from Japan, there's a phrase that's very familiar to you, a word that has come back, moshipura, which means, what if Trump is elected again? So that uncertainty is certainly weighing in the minds of Tokyo's strategic planners. Now, on economic statecraft, there's also a lot that is happening. The terrain is shifting quickly. If I were to summarize for all of you what I think is at stake here, is that we see the growing fusion of economic interdependence and national security. And more governments are looking at economic interdependence through a risk minimization lens, through how we build resilience. And what I've been describing to all of you is that Japan managed to accomplish a lot through a very comprehensive connectivity strategy. And that meant that Japan was active on many different fronts and on many different geographical areas. Now Tokyo also has to worry about this type of vulnerability. And therefore now we find Japan trying to balance this economic internationalism with a penchant for national security protection. And it's not going to be easy, certainly when it comes for Japan to think about how you balance your relation with China, which the economic bond is deep and extensive, but certainly in the national security strategy of 2022, Tokyo identified China as the major security challenge and has already taken some measures to try to minimize vulnerability in sectors where it feels China could use economic interdependence as a source of leverage. And as Tokyo embarks on this economic security track, I would say Tokyo is in many ways a conceptual leader. Japan was the first country, to my knowledge, that adopted an economic security law. And if, with Prime Minister Kishida coming to Washington next month, economic security is certainly going to be in the agenda. And there's a lot of convergence between the United States and Tokyo here, but there are difficulties. I will not hide them, because in Tokyo, there is concern that the United States is mostly playing defensive on economic globalization, that the United States is not interested in comprehensive trade agreements anymore, and that the United States is sending mixed signals when it comes to welcoming foreign direct investment. The Nippon Steel saga weighs heavily in the conversations between US and Japan stakeholders. So let me finish here with one last thought. It is hard indeed to operate in a fractured world as a network power. You're swimming against the current. But we're not transitioning towards a world of deglobalization, for no country can ensure its prosperity or its safety acting alone. Networks will be recalibrated, but they will continue to be a formidable asset. And because of this, I would say Japan will be more, not less relevant for what is to come next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very stimulating and thoughtful, and then so I have a little bit provocative, and so I have a lot of questions, but actually I pick up one question. Today we have Ambassador Schiffer, who was the keynote speaker of the last year's South Star Symposium that took place in Japan. And my understanding of his message in the keynote speech was, so basically US and Japan are at the same side, and then on the seesaw, and then confronting various problems in the world. So you started with sober image of international relations or politics. I think the image is like US and Japan work together to wrestle with these problems. But at the same time, we often say, especially I say to my students, you can do anything, but you cannot do everything. So if you pick up an issue area that you think US-Japan cooperation is particularly helpful, what is the issue area?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough one because there's so many important areas. Well, I think that certainly stability, deterrence, making sure that as much as possible, the alliance is very solid in sending a signal to destabilizing actors that provocation is too risky.
That's for you.
It's not on.
I think so.
Is it on?
No.
No. Oh, so what should I do? No, it's good. Maybe I can just put it on the screen. Can you hear me now? Yes. So I mean, so what's most important is very difficult to pick. I would say maintaining a strong regional deterrence is very important. I would also say that trying to address the difficulties and the complexities of dealing with China is critical, and getting China policy right is very, very important. And I would not, I do want to emphasize that I think Japan and the United States are have converged a great deal in thinking about the China challenge. And I believe that, Tokyo for a long time was skeptical of China and, what China will do as its capabilities increase. But I think that Tokyo has been practicing de-risking for a longer time than the United States. So again, a more balanced approach to how you manage the economic risks from interdependence. So, and now, there's a whole set of topics that have to do with technology promotion and protection. And, I never gave a talk until a few years ago about export controls. And now they're all the rage. So that's a lot of, where the key challenges are. How you make sure that you maintain an open innovation ecosystem, but at the same time that you make sure that some of the most sensitive technologies that you want to protect are well guarded. So I think on traditional security topics, and I think also on economic security, and certainly on how to maintain stability and how to have a well-balanced approach to China. Those would be my wish list of things for the alliance to address.
Thank you. I asked you to pick up one, but you pick up three. It reflects like how important U.S.-Japan alliance is, and then also how many problems that we are confronting. So I usually call it the current world is kind of tumultuous. So that was one of the part of the title of the Symposium, I think 2019, before 2018 actually, so before pandemic. Okay, I'd like to open to the floor of the Q&A discussion. Who wants to kick off? Please wait for the microphone and please identify yourself.
Hello, my name is Ken Beach. A simple question from the U.S. perspective, from people that you talk to. Where is the challenge that we or the U.S. is having with Japan?
Well, I think, the U.S.-Japan alliance is probably the strongest it's been in a very long time. That does not mean that there are no challenges. I think that from the point of view of Washington, sometimes people wonder, can Japan, in the absence of a figure like Abe, continue to be as proactive and as effective? I think Japan can, because all the changes that I have been describing are not just about one individual. And I think actually Prime Minister Kishida, even though he's struggling with his public opinion support levels at home, has actually done some very significant things in foreign policy. One of them taking a very decisive action in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But nevertheless, the questions linger. And it seems that both sides are thinking about how domestic politics may influence the ability of their partner to stay the course. I think that certainly a year of elections here in the United States, but also given what's happening in Japanese politics, that continues. Another important topic, I think, is that as much as Japan now has revised its national security strategy, has announced that it's going to increase its defense budget in significant ways, whether Japan actually can fund that defense, defense expenditure, and whether it's going to, what kinds of capabilities it's going to acquire, that's also questions I'm sure that from the point of view of the United States are present. So, when we can go down the list, because it's a very, very robust bilateral agenda.
Larry.
Barry Crossman. The opposition has been in somewhat disarray. Is there any chance that with the current scandal in the LDP that the opposition will come forth with a sort of comprehensive and coherent policy that would attract some reasonable sort of challenge to the LDP, or is that just wishful thinking on some people's part?
Well, I think that probably not very likely that will happen, but I have heard some informed observers of Japan make the case that this crisis might be different, but I still don't see the opposition coalescing and, and providing a real attractive alternative to the LDP. So it's very hard to imagine that they could actually succeed. Now, the LDP does faces significant challenges. There's going to be a by-election in this April, and that will take also the temperature of how people are feeling. But nevertheless, I think that what may happen is that in the next time around, when there's a national election, that LDP will lose some seats, but not necessarily that there would be an opposition party victorious.
Jim?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you to elaborate on what's happening in Japanese defense policy. I think here in Dallas-Fort Worth, you've got one of the largest, if not the largest, concentrations of defense industries. This region has a big stake in Japan's rearmament, but that's not what I want to ask you about.
Okay.
I think you know I've written extensively about migration, immigration, and you touched on the fact that Japan is a very rapidly aging society. I think in 50 years, population is going to shrink dramatically. I mean, it's not just Japan, it's Korea, it's China, across Asia, except for South Asia and Indonesia and a few other places. So I guess my pointed question to you, we complain a lot about migration, immigration in this country, but we should count our lucky stars because it's a source of, you know, revitalization of our society and our economy. So will the Japanese, you know, seize this dilemma? Will they open up and really begin to bring the people they need from around Asia and elsewhere? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question. I think that Japan is actually changing on this front. Japan is not a country of migration, but in fact, the number of foreign workers has increased quite significantly over the past few years. And we also now begin to see changes in policy to try to attract foreign workers, because there's a clear understanding of how severe the labor shortage is. So in 2015, there was a very important revision to the immigration law that for the first time, I think, openly recognized that Japan needs labor manual workers to address its many, many needs. And, you know, you look at the numbers and the deficits in terms of how many people are missing to be able to provide, you know, support for construction, for healthcare, for agriculture, the numbers are quite large. So in that 2019 review of the immigration law, there was an acknowledgement that it's important for Japan to bring manual workers. And in the past, they had come through what is known as the side doors. So there were, you know, trainees or other ways in which they would be coming into Japan. But now there's an important change. And unfortunately, what happened in 2020, the pandemic set in and Japan closed its borders for a very long time. Since then, I think there's been an important move to try to be back on track. And, you know, the latest news is that the trainee system, which has been very controversial because these are mostly people from developing countries coming to Japan and not always in the best employment terms, that is going to be phased out, with an understanding now that Japan is actually competing for workers at all levels of skill, from the most advanced to, you know, just very manual, plain manual work. But it's hard, you know, because South Korea needs them, Taiwan needs them, and how do you make Japan more attractive has become, but the fact that we're even having now that discussion and that you begin to see the policy regime change, I think it's significant.
David. David Cam. My question is kind of a follow-up to James. I'd like to know Japanese in general, how do they look at our immigration problem?
Well, I'm not sure, you know, this allows me to make another point that nevertheless, as much change as I see Japan undertaking this area, most of the discussion is framed in terms of foreign workers, right? So they're supposed to come for a number of years. One of the visa schemes would allow for longer stays and you can come with your family. For the most part, politicians are not prepared to talk about actual immigration. It's mostly about foreign workers. And we know that many other places who have tried just to bring foreign workers, that also has created difficulties down the road. So I think that one of the key challenges for Japan is to provide adjustment support. Now, I'm not sure that whether they think that the U.S. experience is completely relevant to them, just because of the sheer difference in numbers when we talk about number of arrivals.
Yes. Sandy Miller. I was curious when you briefly mentioned the quad defense system. I was wondering with the quadrilateral defense. I was wondering, what do you see the trajectory of that defense system being, and how will that affect policies with China?
So, thank you. So the Quad, it's not an alliance. It's not a formal defense grouping. So it's mostly, it's Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. And this grouping has origins in how these nations came together to respond to the tsunami. And later on, Prime Minister Abe had an idea that this would be a group of countries, maritime democracies that would come together and try to provide stability in the region. The first Quad did not really take, and it had to be relaunched 10 years or so later. And I think that a lot of it has to do with many of these countries growing a little bit more skeptical of China. It's not defined as an anti-China group by any means, but it's about, having these maritime democracies think through about how to provide public goods to the region. Now, I think that the Quad has endured and prospered, and it was elevated. Leader summits now taking place, but it also has its challenges. And certainly, for example, India's more ambivalent position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine created some strain. But we have to understand that this is not a military alliance by any means. It's a diplomatic endeavor of how you actually try to provide alternatives to growing Chinese presence in the region in many ways.
Zoe.
Hi, I'm Zoe Roberts. My question, Dr. Hallfield kind of avoided a question about defense, but I want to ask one. So, I was wondering, you talked a lot about cybersecurity and about Japan's initiatives with the National Security Council, things like that. In terms of Japan being in a dangerous neighborhood, quote unquote, and those kinds of things, do you think that the nature of cybersecurity voids any sort of conversation of an amendment to Article 9 in terms of defense? Or would you say that that's not really on the table and won't be?
All right, so let me just take your question as to Article 9 and whether these changes in Japanese security policy might lead to a change there. I think that if we want to understand the evolution of Japan's defense policy, it's moves incrementally, gradually, and as much as Japan has changed, and certainly I alluded to the 2015 national security reforms, whereby the government changed how it interprets the constitution. So now it's possible to exercise a collective, the right of collective self-defense. But even that came with a very high bar before the government can decide that it applies. And Japan's existence, for instance, must be at risk. So this means that when you look at all the allies of the United States, even post these 2015 national security reforms, Japan operates, I think, with the harshest, most strict limitations on the use of force abroad. Now, what I find very, very interesting, the Japanese constitution has not been reformed, and it's very difficult procedurally to do so. And most people feel very strongly that Japan actually has done well with Article 9, and therefore there's a lot of reluctance, I think, to change it. And the government has actually found ways to interpret and to continue its evolution in security policy without changing the constitution. But what I think is really interesting of late, I found that, when Russia invaded Ukraine, even though it's in a completely different corner of the world, I think that changed in many ways how the Japanese public thinks about the risks that the country faces. And that, I think, has created a situation where there's been more understanding for why you have these more straightforward or more ambitious definitions of what are the national security challenges for the government. And you have politicians, for example, in their political manifestos when they go to campaign, advocating for a more robust security policy and defense expenditure. So that's a change in public opinion that I think enables these more ambitious national security policy. But there's one area where I think the Japanese public has not changed its mind, and that is a reluctance for the self-defense forces to engage in some kind of kinetic theater outside the borders of Japan. So combat overseas operations is not something that the public or the government is eager to push on. So again, Japan has changed. Japan can do a lot more than it did in the past, but we also have to be mindful of what has not changed or how slow or gradual the process of adjustment is.
Akita-san.
Thank you, Hiroaki from Tokyo. Allow me to ask a journalistic question because it is my profession. So, if you advise the Prime Minister Kishida, what is your advice for him to better prepare for the possible second term of the Trump administration? I'm sure that Kishida doesn't play golf as much as former Prime Minister Abe, so maybe he needs to have another tactics, and also, but to be serious, what Japan could do to better prepare for.
Yeah. Well, I think that couple of things. It is true that many people say how Prime Minister Abe was a Trump whisperer, right? That he really created a rapport with the president. And when you talk to Japanese diplomats, what I hear is that there was a very specific way in which every conversation started. And I think that the successors of Prime Minister Abe can do the same. And that is obviously talk about Japanese investment and how much job that creates or weapon sales. So the tangible economic benefits, that's certainly going to be important. But I actually feel that the Trump-Abe bond went further than that. And that from what I hear, that President Trump trusted Abe and Abe's read of what were the most important regional challenges. And that's going to be, I think, hard for someone who's not Abe, not impossible, but it's not a foregone conclusion. So obviously the talking point in terms of preparing the charts of where the investments are will get you so far, but it's not going to be everything. I also think, and we probably should not be speculating, but we cannot assume that a second Trump term would be the first of the first term, right? We are in a different international environment and a different political environment. So there'll be more curveballs, I think, going the way of Japan and the United and other allies. And what I would suggest is continue to institutionalize as much as possible the security, the economic initiatives you have with the United States, and also, quite frankly, continue your diversification efforts, because a lot of what I've been describing in terms of this network diplomacy allows you to have it in many ways both ways, in the sense that these are initiatives that deliver in deepening the U.S.-Japan alliance, but also are bringing together like-minded countries, partners, who may want to be talking more to each other in case the United States sort of begins to look more at its own belly button.
Right.
I'm Lai Young, senior fellow at the Tower Center. I also teach political science, like Hiroki does. So the answer you just gave is a perfect segue for my question. Where does Southeast Asia fit in Japan's grand strategy? And I realize that's a huge question, so let me narrow it down a little bit. First, in terms of tensions in the South China Sea, how does Japan see its role in that, if any? And second, the United States has traditionally adopted a hub and spokes approach to Southeast Asia. That sounds a little bit different than the network power, network alliances that you've been talking about this evening. How would that work out? How would Japan reconcile its building its network power to the approach that the United States has generally preferred?
Thank you. Those are great questions. And Southeast Asia figures greatly in Japan's diplomacy, and they have not always gotten the region right. And I think that obviously Japan has a difficult history with the region because of its wars of expansion, in the, 1940s and so forth, and therefore it has not been easy to rebuild trust, but it has happened. Think about how far we are from the 1970s when there were riots, when Prime Minister Tanaka was visiting the region, and I think that Japan really changed the approach then, and they launched a different take on, say, economic assistance, so that Japan would not be perceived as the self-serving economic power. And it's very interesting to note that, you look at the survey opinions about which country is most trusted in the region, and Japan comes consistently on top. And I think that is built through years of a consistent approach to the region and of providing meaningful economic assistance, and not, having you show up and then you disappear for a while. So that consistency is very important. And nevertheless, Japan has stumbled in some ways. I think that when Japan first launched the Quad, many people, many officials and elites in Southeast Asia were not very happy, because they feel that this could come at the expense of ASEAN centrality. And one of, I think, the most important takes that Tokyo learned a lesson from that. And before they relaunched the Quad the second time, they actually spent a lot of time traveling to the region, doing a lot of diplomatic engagement, trying to create that groundwork, so that the Quad and Japan then launched the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which is broader, and then the Quad. So I think that there's been a learning process here, but the challenges are steep. And lately, what we've seen is, for example, Prime Minister Kishida visited it was Philippines and I think Thailand. And they're also talking about boosting that security cooperation. And one of the very interesting things that's about to happen when Prime Minister Kishida comes to Washington is that they're going to have a trilateral summit with Marcos as well. So again, this speaks to these growing multilateralism. And I would say that Japan has been practicing it very actively, but the United States on the right, and they also talk about these multilaterals as being something that they want to put connective tissue to what was perhaps more of a hub and spoke approach, because that's not sufficient anymore. The question here is, there's a lot of action, there's a lot of diplomacy, there's a lot of meeting. Which of these initiatives will actually take root? Which ones will be significant? And given what has been just happening between China and the Philippines, this is going to be of utmost importance, but also it's going to have immediate, I think, repercussions, because you are seeking a stronger security cooperation in a theater where there's a lot of tension ongoing.
Last question from Lydia.
Hi, my name is Lillian. Going back to our conversation regarding migration, do you see the influx of foreign workers as sustainable for employment? Do foreign workers have similar social safety net as Japanese citizens? In other words, how do foreign workers feel politically welcome in Japan long-term, and does that even matter when it comes to foreign employment?
Well, I think that how they feel about Japan matters greatly, because Japan needs them to be there. It depends on what type of worker we're talking about. Workers that are highly skilled, they can get visas much faster, and they can, with family reunification benefits, but it's actually the manual workers where I think a lot of the uphill battle has been. As part of these immigration reforms, Japan created 2 different types of visas for manual workers, and again, they're separated by level of skill. It's in that more advanced skill set where there's the possibility to renew the visas to stay longer and to bring family. But where they feel that they get enough compensation and pay, I think that most people that earn yen today these days don't feel that way, and that goes for foreign workers and Japanese workers, right?
Jim, do you have?
I don't think we can stop this evening without one question. Taiwan.
What is the question?
Can you tell us what is the Japan approach to the Coral Straits relationship, and if hostilities were to break out with the Japanese be there ready? Would they participate? Or simply provide logistical assistance?
Okay, so this is a complex question. Let me just provide a few observations. One is, I think that it's notable that many Japanese politicians are now open to vocally talk about how a situation in Taiwan would have direct consequences for Japan security. And I think it was former Prime Minister Abe who would say that a Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency. And when you look at the map, I think it's clear why that is the case, and also because U.S. bases in Japan, if the United States were to decide to use force, most likely those troops would be mobilized. So that's significant, but Japan has not changed its Taiwan policy, even though the politicians are saying this more actively. It does not have official ties with Taiwan, and does not have any type of robust defense cooperation set up with Taiwan. One of the things that I was most surprised to when I traveled to Taiwan last summer was a comment made by a journalist who said that in her conversations with people in Taiwan, when they were asked if the worst came to pass, who will come to help us? People would say Japan ahead of the United States. And I think that it's very, very concerning, because obviously Japan would not act on its own in a contingency of these nature. So a lot depends really on how the United States were to navigate that situation. And I think a lot of it depends on the actual circumstances that lead to the crisis. And without knowing that, it's impossible to tell you how each party would respond. But I do believe that there is growing awareness of the tremendous risk that is growing because of China's growing coercion, and not recognizing the median line, and just doing more and more, applying more and more pressure. And certainly Beijing is very displeased with the election of President Lai, and on the run up to the inauguration in May, we're going to, I think, see more of this pressure. But again, as much as Japan is changing, being realistic about what has changed or not is as important.
Well, we need much more time, and because as Dr. Solis raised at the beginning of her talk, like there are so many problems in the world,